Hello everyone, my name is James Ritson and I am the product expert for Affinity Photo. So I'm going to show you some various post-production techniques for low light imagery. I've personally always struggled with this kind of imagery when it comes to knowing really what to do at the editing stage. I often find you have to adjust your mindset and skill set compared to say editing portrait or landscape imagery. So over the years of during using Affinity Photo, I've kind of built up some various techniques. So I'll talk you through a couple of image edits. So I will just share my screen and we're off. Okay, so with that in mind, let's see a pretty typical example. So this is a single raw exposure. It's underexposed to try and retain some of the more extreme highlight detail. So we've got some tricky dynamic range to work with. Now, there's a little something I like to do with this kind of tricky imagery. Before we start touching any sliders like shadows and highlights, black point, etc., I like to remove the default tone curve. So we're developing RAW at the moment in Affinity's develop persona. It's basically, don't want to go into it too much, but it's different personas. They're effectively different workspaces for different tasks. So when you drag a RAW image into Affinity Photo, you're taken straight to the develop persona. Okay, so that has a nice sort of intuitive, easy to use layout for manipulating your RAW files. So up on the assistant options here, this little suit icon, we have this option called tone curve. And by default, it applies a tone curve on top of what we call the gamma corrected initial result. So if I actually set that to take no action, you'll see a little bit of a tonal difference here. I'll just zoom in so you can see that more clearly. So here's with the tone curve applied. Ordinarily for most imagery, that would give it that little bit extra, contrast and punch, kind of like what you would expect of something straight out of camera. So a closer match to that. But if we set this to take no action, we remove that extra tone curve. And especially for underexposed imagery, it just gives us a bit of a flatter starting point to do some further tonal work. So in addition to that, what I will also do down here is go to shadows and highlights, and I'm just going to roll the highlights off slightly. I'll just zoom right in here so you can see the effect we're having. So there's the sort of the default level of the highlight rendition. Let's just take it down. I'm not going to take it down all the way, basically because past a certain point, especially if we've actually clipped highlight detail in the raw file, everything just becomes a bit milky and tonally flat. And, these are still highlights. We still want that kind of that perception of, these bright highlight details. So we're not going to roll it off all the way. We're going to go somewhere about here. Okay. And we're going to do the same for the shadow detail. Okay, so rather than push the shadow detail all the way up, which is rather tempting, to be able to see all of that nice foreground detail, we're going to sort of play it down a little bit, maybe not just boost the shadow detail so much. We want to bring a certain amount of detail away from total black, but not so much that the image ends up looking really tonally compressed. It just makes it more difficult to work with the tones and maintain like a natural contrast to the scene. Now, color me crazy, but I'm actually going to leave it there for the initial raw development and click develop. The reason I do this is because my method of working is to be as non-destructive as possible. So I'm going to do all of the major work in the main photo persona with layers. So now we've got our tonally flat image, it's time to go to work. First of all, I'm going to create a selection based off luminosity by using Option Command Click on Mac, or that would be Control Alt Click on Windows. And with this selection now active, I can add a curves adjustment. I am I'm a big advocate of keyboard shortcuts, so you'll see me using a few rather than going to the top menu options here. Case in point, I'm going to add a curves adjustment using Command M on Mac, Control M on Windows, and then to get rid of the marching ants or the marquee selection, I'll use Command D. Okay, so that having created that luminosity selection, that is masked to the curves adjustment. You can see hopefully on the thumbnail here. So now I can just draw out a couple of nodes on my curves graph. So it's nothing too crazy at this point. We're just kind of, making those highlights a little bit brighter, but not overcooking the color detail. We just have that masked to the luminosity. Okay, So now what I think we will do is do some brushwork. So again, ordinarily you might use the Add Pixel Layer option on the Layers panel down here. I prefer to use shortcuts wherever possible. So on Mac, that's Shift-Command-N for a new pixel layer. Shift-Control-N on Windows. Let's call this brushwork, just to stay nice and organized. That is not what I usually do at all. My layer naming is just all over the place usually, but for the sake of the demo, let's stay nice and organized. Okay, so now B for the brush tool, or the paintbrush tool to give it its proper name. Let's switch over to white. So on the color panel, again, we could toggle over to white here. I prefer to use X on the keyboard, and that just toggles between the secondary and primary colors here. So what I'm going to do is set this layer's blend mode to overlay and take the opacity down to about 25%. Or in fact, I'll bring it up a little bit to exaggerate the effect so you can see whilst I'm painting in, and then we'll look at the opacity later. So I like to think of this, as I'm just painting in here, as non-destructive dodging and burning. Okay, so we do have dodge and burn tools located on the tools panel here, but I prefer to use pixel layers with blend modes just because it's more flexible. I mean, you can use different colors. You don't have to just use black and white. You can use different blend modes, different opacities, and so on. And you can really get quite creative with kind of like the enhancements that you add. So we have a little bit of an issue here, which is that I want to kind of enhance the tones in this building, but of course we've got the sky detail here, and you know, we're just not precise enough. I mean, if I just start painting into these edges, you can see we get a halo effect in the sky and it just looks a bit awful. So the trick to this is to mask the brushwork layer. What I'm going to do is select the background pixel layer, get the selection brush tool. I'm actually going to select the background very quickly. It's easier just to select that, you know, that flat tonal region rather than try and select the foreground detail. Then just invert it. So that's on the select menu here, or Shift-Command-I. So we've inverted that. Now we've got the foreground selected. We just need to make a bit more of a detailed selection. We've got some background areas here and also areas on the building itself. So we can go into selection refinement. I wanted to try and sort of demystify selection refinement a little bit. You know, it's traditionally used for cutout work, you know, extracting difficult things like fur and hair, but it's also really useful for compositing, even just creating masks, you know, creating detailed foreground and background masks like this. And all you really need to do at a very basic level is just, you know, click and drag over the difficult areas to matte them, is what we call it, matting the edges. So now that I've done that, you can see I've included this little area in my selection, and across here as well, I've got a kind of a matted, you know, selection of the, well, I guess we call it the foreground detail because it's not part of the sky, but it is in the background, so to speak. So we can output to a selection. That's absolutely fine. Okay, we now have our refined selection. So what I'm actually going to do is save that to reuse later. We're going to reuse it at the end. So on the channels panel, if I scroll down, I've got my pixel selection here. I can right click that and create a spare channel based off my current selection. Here's my spare channel now. I'm going to right click that and rename it to foreground. And that will come in useful later on, you'll see. But for now, we've got a mask to create. So let's click on the brushwork pixel layer and add a mask layer to it. Okay, so now I can deselect, get that brushwork pixel layer, get the brush tool, and I can paint into the rest of the building, like so. Okay, so now you'll see if I hide that mask, all of that brushwork leaks into the sky detail, which is obviously not very good. So that mask is preventing that from happening. That's great. And now we're going to take this opacity down on the brushwork to maybe about 25%. So subtlety is kind of like the name of the game here. We're sort of building up, you see the before and the after. We're kind of building up this kind of subtle layering of tonal effect. Now, what else shall we do? Let's focus on the color, I think. So we've done a little bit of brushwork, nothing too crazy at this point. Now I'm going to tweak the colors using my favorite adjustment layer, that's the selective color. Okay, selective color is great. You'll probably see me use it in a lot of sessions and demos and everything else. It's just a really efficient way of pulling apart different color ranges and really doing some dramatic color transformations. I think for this image, we'll probably keep it a bit low key. On the reds, let's just drag the cyan to the left, so you'll see that kind of reddens up the building here. On yellows, we might just reduce yellows as well, and that gives that kind of gives it a little bit more of a an orangey red tint. Let's see the before and the after. And I think let's tackle the sky as well. So across on cyans, let's have a look at the portion of the sky here. We'll bring cyans up, and we'll do the same for blues as well. Again, I'll show you the before and after, because that might not have come across very well. So here's the before and the after. So we've kind of got a nice cyan deep tone going on to the sky now, and some extra detail, some extra sort of reddening of the building. At this point, I think I might add another curves adjustment. So Command M on Mac, Control M on Windows. And let's just drag that down slightly, add a nice bit of contrast like that. So we're not masking this curves adjustment. This is affecting the red, green, and blue information cumulatively now. So we're also affecting color intensity. And because of that, we might now find that the colors are a bit too intense. Maybe the reds are looking a bit garish. So there's a nice little trick to sort of counteract this, and that's to use an HSL adjustment layer. So again, we can get this off the layer menu here, but I'm going to use my shortcut. So that's Command U on Mac or Control U on Windows. And across on the red color range here, I'm going to increase the luminosity shift. Now this raises the perceptive brightness of that color range, but it also, as a side effect, reduces color intensity, which might be what we're after here. This might be looking a bit too pale, so perhaps let's take that down slightly, and also just increase the saturation a tad, not too much, because we don't want that garish look back, but just enough to kind of bring a little bit of vibrancy back into this this image. We can also do the same for the cyans and blues. So let's move across to the cyans, increase that luminosity shift, and perhaps the saturation. Do the same for blues, like so. Okay. So again, just showing you the before and after as we go along here. Here's before, here's after. So that might not be to everyone's taste. This is a great thing about having a non-destructive layer stack. We are free to experiment with all of these different options without ever committing to anything permanently. So, I could go back at a later date and think, actually, I want a bit more color. Well, not a problem. I can just change the HSL adjustment. Now, another technique that I like to use for adding a bit more drama and mood, whilst also reducing the relative intensity of colors, is to add a black and white adjustment. I'll do it off the layer menu this time, just for something a bit different. And what I like to do is set a blend mode of, say, something like multiply. Now, this looks really interesting. It's a shame I'm not going to keep it like this, because this could be quite an interesting edit. It's really dark and moody. But what I tend to do is just back the opacity off, maybe something like 30% or so. And you can also use the contribution sliders to enhance kind of like the relative brightness of different color ranges. But again, that just adds a little bit more drama, and it just kind of rounds off the edges of the building here as well, if you just see that, the before and the after. Okay, let's do a little bit more brushwork. So I will use my shortcut again to add a new pixel layer, Shift Command N, and let's call this more brushwork. Okay, this time we're going to use a reflect blend mode. Let's try an opacity of, let's go for 50% to start with. We'll see how that looks. And I'm actually going to color pick now off this yellowish tone in the window. So while we've got the paintbrush tool selected, we can Alt or Option click and drag to pick a color. Let's pick that color. And we're going to paint it into the foreground detail here. Okay, immediately I can see this is way too strong, but that's not a problem. Once I've finished painting, I can reduce the opacity. Okay, so another little technique that I'll share with you is rather than scrubbing the opacity on the layers panel here, you can instead use number keys on the keyboard. So for example, if I wanted 20% opacity, I just type 2. If I wanted 12, I could type 1, 2 in quick succession. And there we go. That just looks a little bit nicer. It adds a nice little sort of suggestion to this area here. Kind of creates a nice leading path up to the main detail or the focal point of the image. Now also, another little technique which we can now do in version 1.9 of Affinity Photo, because we've got a divide blend mode, is I like to add a fill layer. Okay, just turn that off for a second, and we're going to recolor the fill layer. So I'm going to color pick off sort of a bright tone up here maybe, but it's got a slight yellowish, creamish cast to it. So I can click there to assign that to the fill, which I will now turn back on. So that's now filled our entire image with that color non-destructively. Then I can set a divide blend mode. Okay, and what that does is it just kind of by dividing the colors by like the color that we just picked, we effectively do like a color cast neutralization. This might be too strong, and in fact it's actually blowing out some of the highlight detail here as well. So again, we could just take the opacity down slightly, maybe to 30%, or let's try 40. So again, if I show you the before and the after, you'll see that's a really, really subtle difference, but it just helps lift those murky yellow tones a little bit. Okay, so we're nearly done with this. Let's add some structure or textural enhancement. And we can do this with a clarity filter, but not just any clarity filter. We're going to use a live filter layer. So if you're not familiar with Affinity Photo, one of the questions we do often get asked is, do you support smart objects? What's your equivalent to smart objects? And the answer is no, we don't have like a smart object replacement, so to speak, or equivalent, because everything in the app is designed to be intrinsically non-destructive. We don't have like a layer that you need to create or convert things to. So live filter layers are just one of the many examples of this. So we have various filters on the filters menu here, but we also have a great number of them as live layers instead. So for example, if I add an unsharp mask, you'll see that's just sitting there as a layer. And we can do the same for clarity. So let me add a clarity layer, drag it out here at the top, and increase the strength. So let me just zoom in so you can see that. Okay, so as I drag the slider up, you'll see we're kind of enhancing the texture or structure in the image. And this is entirely non-destructive. It's just compositing in the layer stack. I mean, the easiest way to think about it is adjustment layers, but for filters. So we have things like, liquify, perspective transform, and all the rest of it that just sit in the layer stack. And of course, the other thing is that we can treat this like an adjustment layer or like any other layer. So it has a mask, and of course we can double click and change the settings. So if I don't want to, enhance structure all over the image, especially in the sky, because we've got some really annoying dust spots here, I can just go to Layer Invert, or use my shortcut Command-I to invert the mask of that clarity filter. And now it's not affecting anything. So now I can go B for my paintbrush tool, set my color to pure white, and just paint into the areas where I want that clarity filter to apply. So again, this is kind of subtle. I do like to do things in a subtle fashion. So let me show you the before and the after. So you can see we've just masked that clarity effect to, the path here and the building. Okay, so we've got a nice little bit of enhancement going on there. Now, almost finished with this image, but let's add some fine detail sharpening. just to round everything off. So there's our live unsharp mask. We'll go into the building here and let's try a radius of 2 pixels and a factor of 2. Okay, and this is where that spare channel that we created earlier comes into play. So we've got that foreground spare channel down here, and I'm going to right click it and load it to the unsharp mask alpha. So now, in fact, I'm going to zoom in so you can really see what's going on here. If I now load that to the unsharp mask alpha, you'll see that it only now affects the foreground. So, you know, just the building and the foreground area and not the sky. Okay. To do this is to avoid over sharpening sky detail because it brings out more noise, which isn't aesthetically pleasing. But there's also a technical consideration. So more high frequency detail is harder to compress. So if my end goal is to have compressed versions of this image on the web, having less noise in the sky will make it more efficient to compress, and it means I can achieve a higher quality at smaller file sizes. So, you know, that's it's worth taking these considerations into account when you're retouching your images. Now, with non-destructive editing is that I can go in and change these settings. For example, you know, the fill layer here, I might want to experiment with the opacity on that and see what effect that has. So if it's having no effect at all, we've kind of got those murky yellow tones, and then gradually as I bring it to the right, we start to kind of neutralize those, and we get a bit more of a bluish tint to the whole image. This brushwork down here, you know, we can experiment with the strength of the path enhancement here. I think anything above, you know, 13 or 14% just looks a bit overkill, to be honest. So let's change that to about 10. The black and white adjustment, maybe we want to try without that at all, you know, or we can bring it back and increase the opacity for a kind of like a darker sort of moodier tone to the image. Yeah, what else can we do? We'll go into the unsharp mask and just drop that radius down to 1 pixel. So we're doing more fine detail sharpening and not sort of local contrast enhancement. And then I'll do a final brightness and contrast adjustment to tweak the final tone. Now, this is a technique I like to use all the time. I like to zoom my image right out and evaluate, you know, what kind of like the perceptual brightness and contrast of it when it's a really small size. And the reason I do this is because, you know, most of my imagery ends up on things like social media, my website, Instagram, that kind of thing. And so I kind of want to cater to that sort of demographic, you know, looking at images on smaller devices, you know, phones, tablets. Let's face it, when people are browsing through Instagram or Twitter or anything else, even your website, they rarely look at images full screen, do they? So I kind of want to adjust the final tones, you know, my final decision-making process based on how this image looks at a smaller reproduction. So I think that works for me, yeah? Okay, and I'm going to leave that image there. Now, we've got, how much have we got? 14 minutes left. All right, so I was going to do another image. I might have to fast track that. Let's do it anyway and see how far we get. So I just need to get my Finder window here. And I'll grab this second image. Okay. All right. So this is, we're going to do a bit more brushwork on this one. So this is underexposed, again, to try and retain some extra highlight detail. I'm generally not a big fan of underexposing or exposure to the right even. But I shot this on a Sony and I found that generally any exposure you see on the preview JPEG is pretty accurate. Whereas when I was shooting Olympus before, I found that the tone curve applied to the preview image was pretty aggressive. So detail that showed as overexposed wasn't necessarily clipped in the raw file. But yeah, with the Sony, it's basically, you know, I can kind of look at the histogram and treat that as gospel. So we've removed the tone curve already. We might just quickly back off the highlights, but not too much because we've blown out the detail here and we've got those ugly halo effects. So let's not try and reveal those too much. Again, like we did with the previous image, just boost the shadows ever so slightly and click develop. Okay, so let's start with a curves adjustment. Okay, and we'll just have some nice highlight enhancement going on here, really bring those highlights up. I'm going to do some non-destructive content removal, or what we call inpainting. Okay, so we got this area here. We've also got this crane. I'm not sure about the crane just yet. I might remove that as well. So to do this non-destructively, we can add a pixel layer above our background layer, rename this to stay organized, and we can use our inpainting brush tool. Okay, and on the context toolbar up here, we set this to current layer and below. So now I can just paint into these areas here to remove those. I'll come back to the crane. I'm undecided about the crane as of yet. Okay, let's see. So some brush work. So again, use my shortcut to create a new pixel layer, and B for the brush tool. I'm going to set my blend mode to overlay. Okay, and set my color to white. Again, use X to toggle across, and then let's try an opacity of about 50%. I'm just going to paint into the foreground area here. Okay, so we're kind of just enhancing the foreground area. Then what I'm going to do is use X to switch across to black and paint into these areas up here to darken them. So I'm taking the focus away from these background buildings or structures, you know, in the sort of the background of the image here. Oh, I've perhaps, maybe I didn't mean to do that, go over that area. It just looks a bit unrealistic. So E for the erase brush tool, and just erase away from there. Good stuff so far. Right, let's create another pixel layer now. This time, again, with an overlay blend mode. And let's try an opacity again of about 1%. And this time, we're going to use color. So I'm going to Option or Alt-click over here to color pick a nice orange, and then paint into some of these areas down here to enhance the color detail, like so. And then also, I think I'll color pick off the blue over here and just enhance these areas as well. Okay, so now let's take this even further. So I'll create a new pixel layer, set my blend mode to reflect. And what we're going to do now is take the opacity down low, maybe 25% or so, and color pick off various tones. So let's color pick off the orange here, and we'll just nice enhancement down here of the various tones. Let's take this across here as well. That's perhaps a bit too strong, so I might undo that and come back to that. I don't know how I feel about that just yet. Yeah, let's do blue as well. So color pick, just enhance these areas too. Okay. So let's just take a look at this. So here are 3 pixel layers. If I hide them, you can see the before and the after. So that's quite a sort of a dramatic difference here. We've taken the focus away from all the background area, but now, we've got this nice focus on the foreground. So I'll take my pixel layer and reduce that opacity slightly as well. And you know what? I've decided this crane is bothering me, so I'm going to remove it. I'm going to go to the inpainting pixel layer, get the inpainting brush tool, and just paint over the crane like so. Just to remove it. We've got some little bright specular areas here, which might actually be stars, which is quite nice, but unfortunately, they are distracting for this particular composition, so we'll remove those as well. Let's go down here and Just remove everything there. There we go. That looks nice. Oh, just a little bit here. Okay, good. So now we've removed the crane as well. That is non-destructible. So, you know, we've still got this on our original image here, should we need it. Okay. Yeah, let's see. Perhaps a bit of selective color as well. This is where our colors really start to pop. So I'm speeding along, my apologies. Just looking at the time. So cyans, let's take that down here. What else? Yellows. Let's take those down as well. And the cyans, that's going to have very little effect. Still, we'll boost the cyans slightly. And like I said before, selective color is kind of like my go-to adjustment, really, for you know, pulling color tones apart and color ranges and that sort of thing. Okay, I'm going to have to leave it there, I'm afraid, because we're going to have to move on to questions and answers. Unfortunately, I would have liked to just finish off this image, maybe do some sharpening, that type of thing, but I'll just use C for my crop tool, crop that in, and that is my finished composition. So you can see with having a non-destructive layer stack, we can start with a fairly bland looking image and just really, you know, in a matter of a few minutes or so, just really bring the colors out and enhance them. Okay, so thank you very much for watching. I'm now going to stop sharing my screen. Okay. And yeah, I really appreciate everyone tuning in to watch. So we've just got a few minutes left. I'm just going to try and address any questions that are in the chat. No, I think that's good. Okay, so no additional questions in the chat. But yeah, thank you very much for watching. And like I say, we've got about 6 minutes left of the session. So if anyone does have any questions now, please do ask them in the chat. I'm more than happy to address anything, you know, whether it's photography related or to do with Affinity Photo, the software. Okay, so it doesn't look like there are any questions particularly. Yeah. Okay. So I'm going to leave it there. Like I say, if anyone does have any questions, please do, you know, just post them in the chat box. I'll be monitoring the chat, you know, sort of afterwards anyway, and I can just answer anything by text instead. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching.